Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fathoms Deep, a Black Sails podcast from Common Room Radio. I'm Elizabeth Stevens.
I'm Daphne Olive, and we are joined by Claire Willett, who is a writer and also, I guess I confess up now, one of my favorite people on Twitter. Claire, I actually was hoping you would watch Black Sails. Sorry. I guess I should have warned you that I had been stalking you on Twitter before.
Low-key stalking.
That makes me so happy. And I did, and here I am.
I know, it worked out great.
Sometimes you can tell who's going to love the show. Like, this is for you. You're going to love this.
Right. Well, and especially people who tweet about shows that they're watching, and like you, I don't remember what you would watch before this, but like you were watching, and then I think you even said something where you're like, I really need a show with like happy queer stories. And I was just like, yeah. I did not tweet at you because I don't do that, but I like let other people do it. And I was just like,
calling this a happy queer story? That seems like maybe a stretch.
That will be part of our conversation. So,
okay.
We'll get there.
We'll get there.
Fair enough.
So yeah, Claire, let's start with how we usually start with our guests. Will you tell us your Black Sails story? How did you get to Black Sails? And tell us about your watch.
So it had been on my radar for a few years. I used to up until about, I think 2 years ago, I co-hosted a podcast recapping the show The 100, and which of course is where Zach McGowan bounced to after Charles Vane died. So I knew of it. I think that was the first that I had heard of it was in the season before that when they announced that he would be joining the cast, and a lot of people that I knew from the 100 fandom were watchers of Black Sails, and people were super, super excited. And I loved Zach immediately. His performance was fantastic and his character was fantastic. And so I always kind of had in the back of my mind, like, oh, I should check out that other show that Zach was on, because he's just compulsively watchable, I think.
Oh yeah.
When he's on screen, you're just like, I'm watching you. I don't like my house could be burning down and I'm just like, I'm watching Zach McGowan's micro expressions. And so I think he's just wonderful. And so I kind of had it flagged for that. Like, this is a show that already has one actor that I really know that I like. I think as the show was ending, while season 4 was on, I was seeing more and more people like who I know, from the fandom talking about it and tweeting about it. And like a lot of entertainment journalists and people that I know who like write about fandom or write about shows for fandom, the people that I knew sort of through that sphere from the 100 were also covering this show or talking about this show. And so it sort of always seemed like something that was in the wheelhouse of, people who like the things that I like also like this show. And I can't actually now remember why it was that I sort of didn't watch it and then like why I started it. I think that it might be something just as simple as like, it just popped up on my like Hulu thinks you'll like this. And I was like, oh, right. That show that I've like always been meaning to watch and didn't realize I already had available to me on one of my free streaming platforms, So then and then once I started it, I was like, oh, I'm going to power through this. I had been sort of forewarned earlier, like long before I'd started watching it, but just when people were recommending it to me, by multiple people who basically were sort of like, you got to sort of get through the first couple episodes because there's sort of like one big trigger warning thing to be aware of. And then once you're through that, it's like smooth sailing, pun intended. And that was very much my experience where I was sort of like, okay, this is, and circle back and talk about that more. But sort of once I was over that speed bump, it really was like, this is all I want to do all day long. It's just to watch this show. I think I knew going into it, I knew like the gays love this show. It's like it's a gay pride show, and I was like, okay, but I didn't know who was gay, and I didn't know that like how any of those storylines were going to play out. I didn't know how people's arcs would evolve, and I think just because my friends are good people, the people that I know who recommended the show to me were very careful in not spoiling anything that they wanted to sort of like watch me react to in real time. Really, I think because everybody just wanted me to tweet about it. Everyone was like, maybe she'll live tweet this show. And then I did. So I got to experience the sort of twists and reveals and things like that as twists and reveals, which in a show like this I think is really important. Not that it like requires it, like it has, I think, an endless level of rewatchability because it doesn't need a shock twist for the story to have interest. But the first time through, getting to sort of like when we talk about when we get to our the part of our agenda talking about character deaths, like when you realize that Vane's really gonna die this time, like that he's not gonna get out of this one, like that's something, like I knew eventually at some point he was gonna die because Zach was on another show, but I didn't know it was gonna happen then. I didn't really know, how many seasons people were in. Eleanor was the same way. She dies so early in the final season that you're like, this can't really be it for Eleanor, and then it is. And so I think Miranda, like all those moments, I think I think getting to experience them without having those things be spoiled is a real luxury in a show that is already completed and off the air, and people have sort of moved on to talking about it in a more spoilery, kind of way. So I feel really grateful that everybody sort of helped me preserve this kind of pristine binge watch experience, so I could sort of react to things as they were happening. But I loved it on many different levels, like both as a writer. I think just the writing of it is so wonderful that it's a story that's about storytelling, which is something I think is kind of marvelous. And also, I was a huge Treasure Island kid. That was one of my favorite books as a child. I have I think at least 3 different old battered vintage copies of it. I loved anything that was set on a boat. I loved anything that was about pirates or ships or sailing or water. Mutiny on the Bounty and Voyage of the Dawn Treader, any a kid on a boat. My favorite literary genre as a child. And
did you read The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle?
A long time ago.
Wow, Liz, I forgot about that. You used to talk about that.
Deep cut.
Deep cut for that's very specific small area of childhood fiction set on a boat. Yes.
God, I forgot about that one, but yes, I definitely did.
Yeah.
So that's so fun. So I think I had not realized until around the time that I was starting my rewatch, or starting my binge watch of it, I had not known initially that it was in any way connected to Treasure Island. I was just sort of like, that pirate show that this actor that I now really like is on. So that just sort of added another really fun layer of, the memories that I had from how the book Treasure Island begins and what or what you think that about the fates of these characters, getting to watch, how is Billy Bones going to end up back in England with a map? How does Silver evolve from this sort of sass pants little, cutie pie who seems like he isn't really that terrifying, and Flint could break him in half with his little finger, become the one man that we know that Captain Flint fears. All these sort of things that are part of the setup of what makes Treasure Island, how the story kicks off. But then something else that I think is also really interesting that we can get to when we get to the finale is sort of I was thinking about this today as I was rewatching the finale, the idea that, again, because it's a story that's about storytelling, that it allows you to question what of the things that we're told happened in Treasure Island, what if those things are true, and that sort of ambiguity. So there's just lots to sort of explore there, but that was an extra layer of fun, of feeling I know these people, I think that I know these people, and now I'm going to find out all the things about them that I actually don't know and sort of see this other side of them. But so there was just, it had boats and gays and women with swords, the only 3 things I feel like I really need in a television show. But and also just really, really, really wonderful writing and story structure, and that it didn't do a lot of the things that I really hate in television shows that have become sort of something that I'm, more finicky about in the things that I watch and in the media that I consume, and what are the messages about violence, and what are the messages about women, and what are the messages about relationships, and what are the messages about queer people, and all those kinds of things. And there were sort of a lot of places where I felt like I could see what a similar, more cynical show would do with a particular story point, and then I would just watch Black Sails just tiptoe right around that landmine and just skip it all together. And I was just like, wow, that's really refreshing.
Mm-hmm.
Is very refreshing. It's totally true. So wait, I just want to say something to our listeners. Yes, Claire did say we were going to talk about the finale. And yes, we are. So, and I would like to dedicate that portion of our podcast, if not the whole thing, to Toby Schmitz, because he actually did the last time we record say, can y'all just do that already? I mean, he didn't say it like that.
Hi, Toby Schmitz. I think you're wonderful.
As boys go, he's pretty good.
So yes, we will be talking about the finale, maybe not in the way people expect us to. So yeah, I'm really happy to hear that people did not spoil you. Black Sails fans are, I feel like some of the most serious about preserving the storyline for people, which is fascinating to watch. There are other fandoms where people love to spoil people, and which is kind of mean. I don't understand where that comes from. I do understand where this comes from, because I do think, as rewatchable as the show is, there is a special magic of watching it the first time.
Yeah,
absolutely.
If we want to start talking about women, I would be very interested to hear your first impressions for Max and Eleanor in the pilot.
Oh yeah. So, the women on the show I think are wonderful. So Max and Eleanor. So I think we'll start with Eleanor. So what I liked about Eleanor as a character was that I felt like she was written in a way where it was like she was freed of us having to find her likable to be interesting, that sort of trap that you fall into with women characters where they're not allowed the level of messiness and complexity and nuance and doing things that we disagree with or dislike sometimes in order to remain somebody that you're still rooting for, or still emotionally invested in. And so for me, I feel like, right off the bat, I was like, okay, this is a woman who is engaged politically in this sort of jockeying for power, not just as a woman, but as a young woman and as a daughter, as somebody who's kind of introduced in a way where she's sort of other men view her in relation to the other men in her life. She's this guy's daughter, she's this guy's ex, she's in kind of a partnership or something with Flint. She's defined to men by her relationships with other men, but she's not defined that way by the narrative. And that's a really tricky needle to thread, I think. We're not meant to see her that way, but we understand why. And that's something that I think actually it continues over the course of the show, and is even sort of addressed at one point in sort of the conversation about, you're so tired of, fathers telling you what to do, or isn't this Woodes Rogers guy just all the rest of it? This sort of revolving door of men who the world sort of seeks to define Eleanor in her relationship to these men, and all she's trying to do is be defined on her own terms. And sometimes it makes her an asshole. Sometimes it makes her do things that we think are terrible. And, and she comes right out of the gate with fuck in every other sentence. And so you're sort of I know who this woman is. What I liked about that sort of first introduction of just how very how abrasive she is and how sweary she is and things like that is, you sort of know it's a little bit of a construction. She has to push it harder because she is, the one woman in this world full of men, because all of these men sort of see her as well, she's just sitting in daddy's chair, she's she has to work so hard. And this is, I think, the thing that she has in common with Max too. It's like they both have to fight so hard to be given a seat at the table and taken seriously, even though they're smarter than like every idiot man around them, but the world doesn't take that for granted. And I think something that is that's really nifty and really, I think, dexterously handled by the writers about, you know, sort of the question of like the feminism of the show. Are the, you know, women presented in a way that we would identify as feminist? Are they empowering women characters? Are they, and it's like the world of this show doesn't pretend like there's no misogyny, you know, like right. It doesn't pretend, it's not a fantasy where sexism and violence against women don't exist, or where the women that we're attached to emotionally are sort of magically invulnerable to that. Like they're all susceptible to all of the societal forces that you would sort of expect in this world, but we do get to see them triumph, and we do get to see them figure out within those frameworks sort of how to survive and how to kind of jockey for power and how to win and how to use the fact that they're smarter than everybody else to sort of, you know, to climb to the top. And I think the two of them together are so interesting because they're counterweights to each other. You know, at the beginning of the story in the pilot, Eleanor has significantly more kind of power and influence and money and kind of political heft. And then, you know, by the end, Max is like, you know, running all of NASA. And so the way, you know, one rises as the other falls, one falls as the other rises, periodically they drift apart and then kind of come back together again. So I think it's interesting the way that their arcs are really linked, but Eleanor is really the one who is sort of introduced to us as like, I mean, she's just a scrapper, you know, like she will just get in there and get her knuckles dirty. And I love that. I love that immediately about her. I was sort of like, if the arc of this show is Eleanor Guthrie's villain arc, I'm actually totally on board with that. I think, and it turned out a little bit in season 4. Like she kind of like came back around on it. But I was thinking like if you stopped watching the show with the season 3 finale, you could make an extremely solid case that Eleanor's sort of inadvertent super villain, you know, origin story journey is like the way that she convinces herself that what she wants, what's best for her, is what's best for everybody. You know, she talks so much about NASA, what's best for NASA, what NASA needs. And she never really means NASA. She means herself in relation to NASA and the power that she wants to have and the ability to do something with NASA that is hers and not her father's, not Vane's, not Flint's, but like build something that is her own. And it's not, you know, it's not never about other people, but it is always sort of primarily centered on her need to be self-actualized and to sort of have this thing that is her own and build a world that is her own and be successful on her own terms. And more and more and more, you watch her lose sight of her connections to other people. Like she becomes more and more willing to let other people go or trade other people in or, you know, cut ties with people whose relationships with her used to be really important in order to get what she wants. But she keeps telling herself like, but it's still ultimately for their good, but it's still ultimately for, you know, everyone else's good. And by the time you get to season 3, when she's completely thrown in her lot with Woodes Rogers and, you know, and she's standing there, you know, watching Vane die, which she's completely gone rogue and decided to do herself. Like that was all coming from her. You can see exactly how she got there. Like all those steps are sort of so clearly marked. And so that was really interesting to me. Was I kept like all along the way thinking like, is she going to turn out to be like the big bad of season 4? Like that would be kind of amazing. And she's not, you know. But I liked getting to sort of go on that journey of like, I have no idea, girl. Like how is your story going to end?
Were you disappointed at all that she didn't end up being that supervillain when that was where you thought it was going? Did you feel that it kind of deflated a little?
No, I loved I loved the ending for her.
Yeah.
It felt right. Like it felt
Good.
like in the in the moral universe of Black Sails, like the things that she has done, like it wouldn't feel right for her to get to sail off into the sunset and have a happy ending. Like she'd unequivocally done terrible things, and other people in the show who had unequivocally done terrible things, like it doesn't feel satisfactory that there's no cost to those things. And I think it wouldn't have felt right for, like, you don't really want Eleanor and Rogers to win. You don't really want the ending of the story to be them as like the president and first lady of Nassau. You know, like it, no matter what happens to everyone else you like, it's just like, that's just not a satisfying ending. She's not who you want to come out on top and be the victor. But I think the work that she needed to do to sort of pivot from that kind of villain arc was she had to stop. She had to find a way, I think, to form a connection with another person and put that person's needs before her own just for a minute, in a way that had really been kind of the issue with her before. And I think that she does that with Maddie. I think the fact that, like, the last thing that she says to Flint when he finds her dying, you know, like, he gives her sort of the consolation of the lie about her husband so she can die still believing in the thing they were trying to build together. But that she says, you know, like, that it's important to her that he know that she tried to save Maddie, you know, and the whole scene that the two of them have was just, Maddie's amazing. But like that whole conversation they had, and sort of the way that they navigate this sort of tricky emotional territory of like, what is their relationship to each other? And it's all really triangulated around this shared father figure. And so I think that she's humbled by Maddie, by sort of the realization of what, like, her existence has sort of forced Maddie to become, you know, like Maddie doesn't get to be with her father because her father has this other role that he has to play that Eleanor has been sort of unconsciously benefiting from the whole time. And so I think Maddie helps her confront the stakes of a lot of her decisions, and not even like the big messy, like, kill Vane decisions. Like, I don't think Maddie cares about that, but the little sort of like privileged white princess entitlement decisions, and her centering herself in everybody else's story, like all of that stuff, she really has to face that with like the one person who can really ask her to face that. And so I think the fact that they come to some kind of, not absolution, but just sort of like a truce really with each other. I think that happening before she dies, and that then she, you know, and then she dies, you know, trying to save herself and save Maddie. It felt totally right to me. You know, it felt, I think the only thing that I was shocked by about it was just that it happens so early in that final stretch of episodes, where you're sort of like, oh, this is a key character who's taken out of play like 4 episodes before I would have expected, you know, and it causes an immediate pivot in the direction that the storyline can go. But I liked that final moment of resolution for her. It felt right that she got to have some peace in the end. Like, I think that moment between her and Flint is so beautiful. Yeah. And it was sort of like, I remember watching it thinking like, I'm sort of torn, because part of you was like, you're so like, I was so mad at her, you know, and so mad at Rogers. And part of me, like, sort of mean part of me was just like, you know what, actually, like, I want you to know that, like, your shitbag husband brought the Spanish here, and all of this is his fault, and it's your fault for bringing him. And like, you're like, there's a sort of a mean vengeance part of me is just like, it would be really satisfying in like a super petty way to be like, ha, you were wrong. But Flint doesn't do that. You know, he lets himself be the bad guy, be the wrong person in the wrong. Like, he misrepresented it. Like, he lets her have the comfort of being like, I was right about my husband and you were wrong about my husband. Right. You know, so she can kind of have that moment. So she doesn't die second guessing everything that she's ever done in her whole life.
The thing that I really enjoyed about that from a fandom perspective, or like a watching in real time perspective, is that so many people disliked Eleanor. And the fascinating thing about watching like Twitter the next day after that was so many people were like, they wanted her to die for killing Vane.
Mm-hmm.
And not because of other choices. Like they thought they wanted that. Like that's what they thought they wanted. And then when they got the death that they got, everyone was like, I'm so surprised, but I'm actually satisfied by this. Like this feels right in a way that the version I wanted. Like, and it was really interesting for us. I remember we were talking about it because season 4 is so much about vengeance, and everyone who wants vengeance in season 4, it turns on them. Like whoever wants vengeance ends up being a person who ends up destroying themselves. And it was almost like the viewers were in that position that they all wanted vengeance on her.
Yeah.
And it's like almost like the creators spared us of our own worst impulses.
Yeah. No, I think that's really true. I think that I think it's easy to think that what you want is to watch somebody suffer because they hurt someone you cared about, or they did something wrong. Like it would be easy to imagine a world where, Anne Bonny swings in at the 11th hour in the final episode and just stabs Eleanor in the chest for killing Vane or whatever, like there's a way in which I could see that'd be satisfying to us on some level. But I think why it works so well the way that it does is because I think it's because it isn't a supervillain death. It isn't, her death isn't about all of the bad things that she did. And it isn't about Vane. It isn't linked specifically to that one, the worst thing that she ever did in her whole life. And I think there's something in the story about, all these people who make these choices, and sometimes they think they're doing it for the right reasons, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but none of them ever want to be forever the worst thing they did in their whole life, and Eleanor did so many other things with her life besides just killing Vane. So it feels overly simplistic in some way to be like, you did X, therefore Y. That's just how sort of the moral calculus of this world works. It's like, it makes sense why it would be unsatisfying to have her not die, because it would feel, like an injustice to Vane in the way that things all kind of balance out. But I think letting it happen, with some degree of kindness, and also letting it happen in a way where we're watching, the sort of slow journey over so much of season 4, where there's all these moments where we're watching Flint kind of become more and more like the man that he used to be. It's like his Flint self is glitching, and the real human self with this like heart and compassion comes through. And I think that's who he is in that moment. I don't think that he is Captain Flint, the pirate. I think he's James McGraw in that moment with her, holding her as she dies. I think that's
I have a theory that he's neither Captain Flint nor James McGraw, that he is actually a person that has evolved from both of those.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think, taking the best pieces of both, because you're right, because he can never really be James McGraw again. Like he's been through too much and he's lost too much, and James McGraw exists in a world that doesn't exist anymore. But but he's definitively not like, he's not Captain Flint with a capital F,
Right, for sure.
He's not that myth.
Right.
So I like that. And I also I always really liked their relationship. So this sort of the full circle that her arc, begins so tied to him, and then they drift apart, and they're in separate storylines for so long, and then it ends in his arms. Like the symmetry of that, I was like, this feels right. This feels like we've kind of come full circle, and that he's able to give her sort of that last moment of kindness, but also, that there is like the other sort of tragic element of it is like, it is, it's stupid and senseless and horrible, and it's completely her husband's fault. And so sort of knowing that like him making this deal with Spain that causes all of this havoc everywhere, like, you know, that's a thing that he will have to like, that he will have to live with, you know. It's just like that this is a choice that he made and it causes her death. And so that's like this vengeance, satisfying in the sort of vengeancey way of like, good, I hope you suffer because I really hate you, you know, towards Woodes Rogers. But
well, he's a slightly less complex character, so it's like the show
yeah,
doesn't demand of you that you actually like rethink your like want for vengeance with like you have to rethink it with Eleanor.
exactly yeah. So I think it works on, you know, on all the levels that you need it to work. And I think it is particularly, you know, interesting and surprising that it happens as early as it does. But I also think, and I do want to come back and talk about Max more in a minute, but this also loops into the other piece that I wanted to talk about a lot, which is why the key character deaths work for me. I'm very fussy about character deaths. This is something I talk about all the time when I'm watching TV shows. Like, I think it is so easy to do them badly and cheaply and just for shock value. And I think what works about Eleanor's is that, you know, like all the things that we were saying, like the, you know, it feels right as sort of an ending for the arc of her character, but also it opens up so much story territory that you couldn't really, like places you couldn't really go if she was still there. You know, Vane and Eleanor and Teach too, like they're so fundamentally the old Nassau. Like there's no way you'd be able to get the ending that you get for Max and Featherstone and Jack and Anne and Grandma Guthrie and they're sort of like the kind of the new Nassau, like that would never be possible if Vane or Cheech or Eleanor was still in the game. Like they just would not permit that transition to that whole sort of new way of being. So in order for us to get that part of the story, all of those people have to be taken out of play, just sort of for the world of Nassau to evolve into this new thing. Eleanor's need to be the person who is Nassau, to be the center of Nassau. And Vane and Teach's sort of like old school pirate, you know, methodology, like all of that has to kind of be swept away for this new thing to be born. So like in terms of story, it's like, this is actually a really necessary death, because if Eleanor is still alive, she's not going to let anybody else be the queen of Nassau, which means that there's like a hard ceiling on how high Max can go. And Max's journey is one of my favorite arcs for a woman character that I've ever seen on television. I mean, we do have to get the bad stuff out of the way first. We do have to talk a little bit about where it begins. I mean, I love that the heroine of the show is a sex worker, queer sex worker, woman of color. Like I just, that's just sort of presented so matter of factly right off the bat in the pilot, I think is fucking wonderful. And I love that the journey that she gets to go on is so much about like, that it really values and respects her role as a sex worker. Like it's because of the work that she does that she understands how all of the pieces of this city fit together. And so it's not like, you know, there's no like, ooh, isn't it titillating that she's a prostitute? Like all of the scenes where people are having sex for money are sort of presented in this very like, just another day at the office. Like this is just the work that we do, you know, which just feels so right. You know, like that's like, that feels realistic and it lets it be funny. And I mean, like definitely sometimes sexy, but also sometimes comedic and sometimes just like beige, you know, like, and like, it's just a job. It treats sex work like work, which is sort of, revelatory on television. It's just like we don't see this nearly often enough, which I love. And
and that it has a value, like that it's like that it's work, but it actually is work that gives you a specific skill set that isn't about sex, like that it gives you a specific skill set that has an intrinsic value, which is important in a world where like you go into a pirate story and you assume the people who are valuable are the ones who can kill people with swords.
Mm-hmm.
And so it gives you a whole nother realm in which characters can have power and value in ways that you didn't expect that to be part of the story.
Yeah, and power and strength without ever really getting your hands dirty. You know, in the first couple episodes are incredibly hard on Max, and she's, you know, that she's treated as a thing, that we have to watch this profoundly horrible violence being done to her. Like all of that is just like, it really is, I think I think it wasn't necessarily maybe considered like what the impact of putting that storyline on television that early in somebody's arc, you know, in a show with a largely male writer's room, just sort of like, it's one of those things where it's kind of like, there's an impact to this. You know, when we talk about television, we're never just talking about television and how women of color are depicted on screen, and who is allowed to get away with being violent and shitty towards them. And, you know, and do we punish sex workers for? So there's all these things where, like, if you didn't know what was coming, like if I hadn't known, like, you're going to hit this speed bump in like episode 3 and you're going to be like, oh my God, this is horrible. I can't watch this. And then just like, I promise you things are going to be great for Max after that. And like if I hadn't known that, like I could see somebody just turning the show off and not turning back on again after that scene. And I wouldn't blame them.
Benny did.
Yeah. And I'm glad that I knew, I'm glad that I came to it after the show was done and the arc had been completed, so that, you know, people, like, again, like, you know, I didn't get a lot of spoilers, but I knew like Max is gonna, like, that she gets an arc that felt really, that people were excited about, like, you know, where things land. So I was like, okay, hold out. But it, you know, it is like, it's a rough beginning, especially because she hasn't, because it comes so early in her journey that it really becomes sort of a defining way that we understand who she is. And, you know, that feels like it's a lot of weight to tie to a sexual assault, to be sort of like, this is kind of this character's first big storyline. What I will say about it that I think mitigates a lot of my feelings about that is the fact that they don't shy away from it. Like that they don't sort of change their minds and pretend like, let's all act like we didn't do that. Like, it's having been through trauma remains a piece of who Max is forever. It shifts how she engages with people. It adds so much more weight to, as we watch her kind of learn how to be emotionally vulnerable and open with Anne in a way that we've never seen her with anyone else before, even with Eleanor. So it gives her somewhere to go in terms of like explaining why she has the guardedness that she has, and also that she immediately begins to make choices that are about accruing power around her where she will never be in physical danger again. And that, I think, is the most potent piece of it, where it's like, her clothes just get better and better. I mean, she always looks amazing
and more covered. She gets more covered as you can see that she, you know, her relationship to her own, to using her body as a tool, which is like, I want to get into the thing that you and I talked about today, like how she uses gender in a different way than
Didn't
most
we talk
females.
about like corset armor? Is that what we called it?
We did. We talked about corset armor.
Yeah,
very much so.
We talked about how when she took over the brothel, all of the sex workers were suddenly more covered up. And then when she gave managerial power back to Mrs. Mapleton, suddenly they were more naked again.
I didn't notice, but Mrs. Mapleton has a totally different marketing strategy.
Yes. Yeah. Well, an approach to gender. I mean, that's the thing too, is like Mapleton has more of a like the way I look at it is like Mapleton saying, I'm selling the male gaze to men. Mm-hmm. And Max doesn't use sexuality or gender any less. She just uses it as hers. It's like, this belongs to me. Like, female gendered sexuality belongs to me, and I will use it as I want. But there's always this sense with Max that it's like, she doesn't actually 100% buy into it. Like, she understands it as a construct and a tool in a way that I don't think Mapleton does, because Mapleton is looking at the women through men's eyes.
Yeah, I think Mapleton not being a queer woman means that she is looking at.
We don't actually,
as far as we know. That's true. She is not
in this story.
That's
knows?
A good point. I bet there's great fanfic, but
I'll bet there is.
But yeah, so she is
Andrew
not.
Dice probably wrote it.
But she's not. She's not presented as somebody who takes pleasure of her own in female bodies. She is commodifying that pleasure for men, and like you said, and seeing it through the eyes of men. And I think that I think both Max being queer and also like, having come up through the ranks more recently, like I'm sure Mapleton, like at one point also worked in the brothel. Like that's like the career trajectory is pretty standard, but she's been, when she's introduced to us, like she's been the madam for a while. Like she hasn't, like she has not been doing the day-to-day work. So I think Max having kind of come through that more recently, and also just the fact that it is, again, like, and it's not heavy-handed, in any way in how it's presented, but it's like the linkage to her experiences of trauma make total sense why she would sort of be like, okay, like first priority, figure out a way to, like, I never want to have to do that again. Like I never want to have to sleep with a man again. Like I never want to have to let another man touch my naked body. And it's not sort of like hammered home to us in a way that it is, that it's linked to the trauma of what happened, but it feels right psychologically and emotionally that her refuge would be to begin building a life for herself and a way to exist in this world where she doesn't have to have that trauma like re-triggered by having to be naked with another man that she doesn't trust, which is why there's so much vulnerability in the threesome scene, that she's in some way willing to make some space for Jack because Jack's important to Anne in a way that we don't really see her making space for. Like men are not really how Max makes decisions. Right. Like she does not prioritize men. She uses men strategically, and she uses gender to sort of get what she wants from men. And there's men that she likes or finds useful at various different times. But Jack exists in this world where like Max loves Anne and Anne loves Jack. And so Max and Jack have to kind of figure something out, and what it is never really named or made super clear. And I love the messiness of that too, like of sort of that trifecta, and that they find a way to sort of like make it work and get as much as possible of a happy ever after as is feasible for those three people. And that it still is not like super defined by the end, but that
that look between Max and Jack, I think that look at the end is like, that is the end of their story as a pair, is that you can see kind of the like sibling love. Like it's just like this love and admiration between the two of them when he looks up at her and she looks down at him. Like that, that is the gift. That is the gift that everyone uses for like Max's happy ending, but it happens to be the moment when she's smiling down at Jack.
Yeah, and it really, what I like about that is that it shorthands so much about that they've struck a balance where everybody feels good about what they got out of it. Like that nobody feels like they had, of the three of them, that none of them had to sacrifice something that was going to make them miserable forever in order for the other people to get what they wanted. she's in a place that she wants to be. She doesn't want, she doesn't want to be a pirate. She doesn't want to, like be living on a ship and like showering with 40 guys and, and
can you imagine
like, wearing
and then wearing her sparkly robe,
right? Like Max doesn't want to have to like wear pants, like all these things. Like that's just like that's not a happy
her
ending
thing
for her. No, it's not for her. And
who would do her hair?
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God, right? Those men can't do braids. So she, but the fact that she has that she begins where she began, and by the end of it, she is like, she is fully the power behind the throne in Nassau, which is always what she wanted, and that she's safer that way. Like she's not the face of it. When Eleanor was the face of sort of politics in Nassau, Eleanor was a super easy target, and Max gets to do all the things that she's best at, and use her ability to listen and to gather information and to put pieces together and to get men to tell her things, and her relationships with Adele and Featherstone, and like that she gets to have all of that, and she gets to thrive in a place doing what she's really, really good at. And, and Jack and Anne get to go sailing, get to, sail off into the sunset, but also that they don't cut off their relationship with Max, like that they all still, they're still a little family in a way,
right.
and Featherstone and Adele are in the family now too. So it's just like, that side of the story, the way it ends is so gratifying. Cause like, even though, even though it's bittersweet, because that like, it's
history.
not like Nassau is still a pirate kingdom,
right.
But it's surprisingly warm and affectionate, and in a way that I don't think that anybody was expecting from the end of that show. It was a lovely. What did Toby call it? The candy.
Yeah, that is the candy. That is
and it and it is one of those things where I think, endings are tricky, because I was thinking about this when I was rewatching the finale. Like, what makes endings hard is that in any story, there are an infinite number of places where you could end the telling of that story, and it would be happy or sad, totally arbitrarily. Like there are so many moments in the finale where, like, if you had ended it right at the moment where Silver finds Maddie again and they kiss, and then he looks up and he realizes that the battle is over and that Rackham and Flint captured Rogers and have him at sword point. Like if it cut to black there, you'd be like, everybody wins, happy ending for everybody, And whereas like, if it had ended at a point where, like in the middle of the rift between Max and Anne before that is mended, that would have felt like a really tragic, bittersweet ending for them. That would have really taken a lot of that warmth and joy out of it, because you're waiting for a reconciliation between these two people who clearly matter so much to each other, and you don't get that resolution. So where you sort of choose to draw the line, it's a hard choice to make as writers. And I think the way, if you sort of break the ending apart into sort of the endings that the two different groups of characters get, the way they sort of exist in tension with each other is also interesting.
I think one of the most interesting things that John ever said to us, among many, many fascinating things, was the last time we talked, and he had probably said some version of this before, but it really hit home, which was that the hardest part about spinning out something that's these long form narratives is that stories want to end. And so every day you're fighting to just keep it protracted a little bit longer and keep things hanging a little bit when those knots actually do want tie themselves. I don't think I had really quite thought of it that way, but it made a lot of sense when it comes to seeing how these things, when you branch out a story, and how many shows I think just lose track of what is at the heart of them. And somehow this one managed to keep everything right on that track. So it all felt just as true and just as, like the momentum was always there, I suppose.
Yeah.
Like we never lost anything to inertia, but at the end of it, you're right. There were so many times where you could have closed the book and felt good, but there was magic in where they managed to land everything and where they managed to not quite land anything.
Right.
Yeah, I think that they made all the right choices, and I do think that I think you're so
Oh wow,
right.
that's high praise indeed.
No, I think I have lots of thoughts about the ending, which I'm sure we'll come to in a minute. But I think you're totally right, because I think there is this tendency, more prevalent in American shows, but kind of, I think, becoming more and more common everywhere, where it's like, if the point of making a television show to you is just sort of stretch it out as long as you can because you're bringing in advertiser revenue, and you want it to run for 9,000 seasons with 24 episodes each,
Yep.
then it changes the kind of story that you can tell, and it limits the places that you can go emotionally, because you do sort of max it out. And we see so many times, the sort of peak example of this, I think, is something like How I Met Your Mother, where they came in with this, we know before we've even started writing how the story is going to end. And then it went on for so long, and the characters kind of evolved past the point where that initial ending made sense any longer, but they were so married to it because they were like, well, this is how we always plan to end it. So sort of forced that ending back in. And that was part of the reason why it was so unsatisfying, was everyone was like, well, this is we don't feel like this is the ending that these characters
we're past this.
We've grown and changed with them. Years have passed. That's not what we wanted. And so I think sometimes keeping things letting the story end at the point where it ends organically, letting things have endings, letting a show have, 2 to 4 seasons. Everyone was so up in arms about Watchmen, but they were like, 1 season, that's it. That's how much story we had. And I think that's brilliant. That's not, most people don't do that. Yeah, it's really brave, because it means that you're confident that your story had a beginning and a middle and an end.
Absolutely.
I've been reading a lot of fantasy books over quarantine, because that's my escapism, and I read an amazing book called The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, which is basically it's like lesbian feminist Game of Thrones. It's like girls with swords and dragons, and it's fantastic and incredible.
I want to read
and
that. That sounds wonderful.
So good. And it's 800 pages, but it's one book. And I remember getting to the end of it and just being so struck by it feels so wild to have a fantasy epic not be a trilogy. It's just
exactly.
She was so confident in the story that she was telling that it began and middled and ended in one book. And I was like, yes, that makes me respect you so much as a writer, that you were like, I know exactly how long it's going to take me to tell this story, and I'm going to just do it in one shot. And I feel like that about TV shows that have short runs and real endings. There's always a sort of sense of bittersweetness where it's once you get attached to something and you're like, I really want to just watch 14 seasons of these people that I like being in the same room together. And if it just turns into a coffee shop AU, I'm fine with that, but because you miss them when they're gone, you miss that dynamic. But I do think that just as a writer, letting stories have an ending, and an ending that you've chosen intentionally and have been building towards, feels really, increasingly rare. I think one of the challenges that my friend Erin, who I co-hosted the 100 podcast with, one of the reasons that we stopped when we stopped at season 5, there's 2 more seasons after that, but it was just sort of they blew past every opportunity that it felt like for the story to end organically. And now it's it's in the final season, but it's almost all but 2 of the original characters from the, first couple seasons are dead. It got harder and harder from there to sort of to figure out, is there any kind of satisfactory ending for any of these characters? And then, and some of it is sometimes actors want to move on, and sometimes I think you could tell when the writers were sort of well, we've run out of interesting ideas for this character, so we're just going to kill him. And then, so you're sort of okay, well, that's so now everybody's dead. It's now why am I watching? And I feel and so a lot of my frustration with or with Game of Thrones, shows like that, where it's you use a character death to get sort of a shock reaction from the audience, but you don't really have a meaning or a reason or emotional roots for it beyond just
or even narrative roots. It really is just shock factor. Yeah.
Yeah. This feels like it needs to be a segue.
Yes. Let's segue.
Let's segue to talking about Miranda. This is a topic that's been on my mind a lot lately because I feel like I've heard a lot of chatter about it. And actually, I talked with both of you separately about Miranda's death in terms of the idea of fridging, which I don't want to get stuck on because like I'm actually at this point kind of tired of that term. I feel like it's a term that's now gotten overgeneralized to the point where it started to lose meaning.
Yeah.
But I think we should talk about her death and
Yeah.
in terms of the concept of fridging, if we would like to.
Yes, of course. So I agree. I mean, I think, I think this is one of the things that is so interesting about, that I watched the show, first of all, like all at once over a matter of like 3 weeks and several years after it had ended. So I didn't, it's always really, I think, instructive to sort of like to look at what are the things that read differently. And I had this experience with the 100 too, like things that read differently when you are in the fandom discourse week to week and sort of absorbing, even if you're trying not to, what other people are thinking about or saying about a particular thing. And so I think part of my just having this very sort of like fresh and well preserved and like in my little bubble experience is that I felt very unaware of, like I could sort of see like, oh, I wonder if this is, something that there were people who had issues with, but I could sort of just experience them as experiencing them. And so Miranda for me is very much on my, this is a well executed death that works for me list. The reasons why I think it works and why I would not class it as fridging. I mean, I think it, again, like you said, it's a word that people sort of choose to kind of, it can mean a lot of different things. Sometimes people use it when they just mean like a woman died that I wish hadn't died. And honestly, I'm like, I get that and I support it. Like,
yeah,
like we're all so burned out by violence against women on television that like, I do not want to criticize anybody who's like on a shorter hair trigger than me. Cause it's like, because it is constant and it's everywhere. And, and so I feel like, and also like, and how you interpret things depends on like what your own triggers are like as a woman and, whatever. So this is just me. For me, I would define a fridging as like, was this woman introduced exclusively just so she could die later?
To motivate men.
right.
Yes. And was the only purpose of her death and the only reason why it happened in the narrative to make a man do something later. And to me, I think, first of all, I think Miranda exists as this fascinating, complicated person with relationships with many different people over the course of the show, not just Flint and not just in that moment. So I think her death absolutely changes the narrative and motivates him to do things, but in the same way that Vane's death motivates Rackham to do things. Like they're like it's just a relationship. It isn't the whole, like it's not like the whole reason there was a Miranda on this show
so that she could die.
So that at a certain moment some random asshole would shoot her and that would pivot Flint's story in a particular way. I think I think she's a fully developed person in so many different ways by the time we get to that moment. And I also do think I think that her death had agency. I mean, I think, she is, what I love about that scene and I was shocked by that. Like I did not see that shot coming. I jumped, I was like, whoa, holy shit. Oh my God. So I had like a really intense reaction to it. But it didn't, and it made me really sad, but it didn't make me angry. And the reason for that was because to me, I feel like that guy would have shot either of them. I think if Flint had said the things that Miranda said, he would have gotten one in the head too. Like I think it was, I think that, it's Mr. Security Guard guy on a, with like a, trigger happy finger, overprotective of his boss and one of the two of them got too close. And so it didn't feel like she was killed because she was a woman. It felt like because she was a woman, because she was his quote unquote
or
woman.
that she was damseled in any way.
Right. Yeah. Like she was killed because she lost her shit, and she said things that she had been wanting and needing to say for a long time. And she is the person in that moment. Like what happens is that we watch her, somebody finally puts the pieces together of how they all ended up here and how all this stuff, played out. And it's her. And that it's like, she just looks at the clock, and that we've been seeing the clock, and we've been seeing her looking at the clock, and we know there's something about that clock, and we don't know what it is. And then she drops it, and she's like, I know that clock. And from that, I've reverse engineered the whole story of how all these things happened. And so I think in some ways, the primary reason why it didn't feel like what I would characterize as a fridging is that the thing that she did that led to her death was almost unrelated to Flint, and it was totally about Thomas.
It was about her story. Yeah. It was
about
her, like her relationship with Peter Ash predates James ever entering that story.
Yeah. Yeah. And that it's about, like, this is the man who, like, her husband is, as far as she knows, and again, finale ambiguity, whatever, but like in that moment, it's like her husband is dead because of this guy. And they used to be friends,
right?
And he's trying to be friendly to them now. And so it's that moment of, like, somebody realizing, like, we've been played. This whole thing is a scam. And that revelation that she has, and how she just flings it at him and shames Peter with, confronting him with the fact that she has figured out just from a clock, because that's how smart she is. She has figured out the whole story. Like, it's such an active scene for her. Like, she's in the driver's seat. Like, she's a person who is driving that constant sort of flow of new information for Flint, for us, the audience, is like, we're putting together, like, oh yes, okay, all these pieces that were question marks before, Miranda has answered them. And then she just takes one step too close, and then it's just like, bam, and so it's shocking in the suddenness of it that she's so alive and so, and so powerful in that scene. And then it's just like over just like that, which just is viscerally shocking in a way.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that she was so in control, and the fact that she was the person who, it's not even that it's her death necessarily that is the thing that causes the pivot for Flint. It's like, it's the things that she says before she dies. Like, that's what burns the bridge between him and England. It's not just that somebody shot Miranda. It's that all of the things that he was telling himself, reconciling with England to some degree, could mean, or trying to like reach out an olive branch to, like, one person under English rule who might maybe listen. It's like all of that was a lie the whole time. And that's the thing that he needed to know. And knowing that causes the pivot. And part of it is, is absolutely about Miranda, and seeing Miranda's body, in the following episode, like the following scene, and the fact that sort of Miranda being his last tie to civilization, to England, the one who, like, the only one who really wants to sort of like go back to it.
But she doesn't in that moment. I mean, that's what's so interesting is like, I think as much as his turn in season 3 is about her death, I think it's at least as much about the fact that he was, I mean, if you look at this like a war, like if you look at that part, like that dinner as a war, he was ready to sacrifice himself for some greater cause, and she threw her body in front of him. And that's the difference. Like, it's not like she was passively killed and therefore he was activated. She was active. And I like that you said that you talked about her being active, because her story up until then had been a battle for herself. Like, if you put yourself in Miranda's shoes, completely separate from James, like, her battle with herself was, do I just sit here and be inactive, which is what I've clearly been doing for 10 years, or do I do something? So in season 1, her do something was to that letter, like to try to do that version of something. And then her version of it in season 2 was to help him and take responsibility, because she was part of why they were in trouble. Like, she was part of, like she says, like, you know, Alfred Hamilton basically would be alive if but for her, because she knew what she was doing. And so this was all like her reclaiming agency over her own life.
Yeah. And I feel like I think the storyline that leads up to, and this is in some ways is kind of how I feel about Eleanor too, like the storyline that culminates in the moment that they die, in some ways is their juiciest and most emotionally complicated storyline, you know? And so I you know, it was a bummer because I really liked Miranda, but also, you know, I think, again, if you're looking at it from the point of view of like, does this death open up more story territory than it closes off by, you know, ending our journey with this character? I think it's a hard yes for Miranda, absolutely. And I do feel like, you know, that it does happen in a way where she's active and she has agency, and it's also the culmination of all of these things that we know about her and all of these things that we love about her, and many different relationships and different sort of facets of herself beyond just, you know, like beyond just the idea that, you know, these guys kill Miranda and that's the sole reason that then Flint goes apeshit and burns it to the ground. It's just like, that's not, you know, that to me feels like an oversimplification of both of their motivations and of really what's happening emotionally for all three of the players in that scene, you know, for Peter and for Flint and for Miranda. So that's kind of that's why I didn't want to say that I liked it because I love Miranda and I was devastated to see her go. And I was also very shocked in that moment, but it works for me as story. Like, it works for me in the narrative really, really well. But I know, Liz, did you have a different take on it? I feel like Daphne mentioned that to me.
I don't know that I did. I think that you articulated almost exactly how I felt about it, which was that you cannot spin it in any way to say that her death doesn't motivate Flint. But you also can't say that it was A, always Flint's story, and B, that Miranda always had, as you said, a huge influence outside of Flint and her own life and her own character long before. And she was definitely doesn't fall into that trap of just introduced so that she can be damseled, so that she can motivate heroism down the line. So, I mean, I certainly understand, as you said, people who found it just offensive and tiresome. And I didn't.
Okay. Well, so let's now go to the finale, which is another, I mean, that's an interesting way to talk about the finale as well. And the ambiguity, which I'm no longer afraid to say. Just so Claire, just so you understand, like, when the finale happened, we had it for like 2 weeks already before we podcasted.
Oh, was it even that long?
No, they gave it to us early because I don't remember why. Because like we didn't get an interview or something, so they actually gave it to us really early.
Yeah, I think you are right. We had a little bit of time.
We had it for a really long time to like process it and rewatch and all this.
Yeah.
And then we dropped our episode the night of.
Yeah. And I got to break my rule because generally our rule was I watched it once.
Right.
And Daphne had seen it like 8 times. So I was kind of like fresh take. And she was like, but you really can't do that with the finale. Right. You have to watch it at least twice if you want to get everything that's there.
So we were in a place just in the fandom where talking about it as an ambiguous ending was something that many in the fandom found offensive and got very angry with us about.
Mostly Daphne, because I had left Twitter by then, so she bore the brunt of that. I was like, bye.
Yeah.
I was also the one checking our emails.
True. Yeah. Fact.
So it was like, it just took me until now, whatever number of months, years it is later, to like even like really, I mean, it's not true. I do on Twitter talk about the ambiguity and think that for the most part, most people recognize that there is ambiguity now. And I think it is what you said about the way people react to Miranda has a lot to do, I think, with one aspect of how people read the ending and the ambiguous ending, which is there's like the kind of part we talked about in our finale episode, which was kind of like, there is ambiguity. Here's different ways to look at each scene, then go with your emotions. And like, that's what I like talked to you about earlier, like this idea that like, I personally would like, I feel like a lot of the conversation about the ending ends up with people like cataloging facts and like, no, but there's this and there's this and there's this. And that proves that my version of the ending is the ending. And I'm like, give these guys a break. Like, they're pretty good at this. They constructed a well-constructed ambiguous ending. And like, there are more than two, but I won't bring up the third one that I brought up in our finale episode because Liz got mad at me when I did that.
It was just the worst, most depressing version of anything. And now I can't remember what it was. I just remember that feeling of shut up, fuck you, I hate you now.
That is true. But I was just trying to be thorough.
Sure.
And so there's one way to there's a few ways to talk about it, but like, that was just like my thing has been ever since then. It's just like, if we all just agree that like they did a good job of making an ambiguous ending, then there's like two ways to talk about it in my eyes. One is the like, what feels true. And this is, Liz, I just re-listened to our finale episode where you talked about that a lot, about like the different types of truth, like the lowercase truth, which is basically facts, which again, that can take you in any direction in this finale. And then the capital T truth, like what it means to you. But then there is also the other layer of this, of context, of the history of television, of killing gay characters, which again, no matter how you see the ending, there are gay characters in this show who like not just survive, but like fucking thrive.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's an amazing thing. But then aside from that, there is this other aspect of it.
I think it is. Yeah. Everything, first of all, everything that you're saying makes total sense to me. I 100% can see why people would latch on to it emotionally to a degree that makes it feel like inviting in the concept of a second or different interpretation feels like it is taking something away from them. Like I like I'm a lesbian. I totally get it, and I just, I mean, I will say like, I made a list as I was rewatching today, of little details, thinking like, here's what I would latch on to if I was trying to like make a list to convince myself or somebody else that it ended this way. But also here's a list, which is just as long, of like things that I would latch on to, if I was like interpreting it a different way. And both those lists of things happened, like you can't pick a list. And also the thing that to me comes across the most clearly when you rewatch it is like, because the ending of the other half of the storyline is incredibly definitive. We don't find out like for the whole rest of their lives what happens to Jack and Anne and Max and Adele and Featherstone, but we know how the show is choosing to end their endings. Like there's no ambiguity there. And so that means the ambiguity on the other half of it is in every way totally intentional. And so to attempt, I think, to drill down into, there's one secret key that you have to unlock, and that will prove that that only the left column list of Claire's facts is correct, and you can throw the right column away. I mean, to me, I think so. I mean, I think in broad strokes, how I feel about it is the thesis to me of the finale in terms of that half of the story is character after character after character talking about how the story that matters is the story that feels right to you, or the story that causes the thing to happen that you needed to have happen. Like Rackham has, he and Silver, they have so many great lines about it. And I do think that it's interesting that like, the sort of the open question of the finale is very much about the relationship between Silver and Flint, but it's Rackham who sort of who in some way I think kind of delivers that thesis, you know, when he talks
Absolutely.
about, you know, like he's like, look, I could tell you that Flint's dead. I could tell you that he retired. Who cares? What's important is this conversation that we're having right now. What's important is that Flint has been taken out of play, you know, and, you know, and you can tell other people sort of whatever you want, you know, we fed them a story. And then we also see him, you know, kind of doing the same thing again when he tells the character who we're not supposed to, or is but we don't necessarily know yet, is
Mary Read.
Yeah. But you know, like it's very important that, you know, like there's no piracy in Nassau, and so if you talk to anybody, you tell them, you know, like that's another sort of like, it's lighter, but it's a sort of layer of like, the thing that I say is not necessarily the thing that is like factual. It's just the story that we're telling everybody in order to get what we want, is that there's no piracy in Nassau. And so I think, and even like the thing about, you know, his desire to write the affidavits for Woodes Rogers, you know, and the flag at the end about like, it's the art that makes the mark. Like art has to be true, like it meaning it has to do its job as art and make you feel things. And that's a totally different kind of truth than like facts, you know? So he has all of these moments, you know, particularly in the latter half of the episode, but kind of all throughout, where he's really articulating a relationship with story as story that I think, particularly knowing that, you know, the finale is sort of, this is how we kind of close the book on the Black Sails chapter of these characters' lives, some of which will then 20 years from now, you know, when Treasure Island happens, you know, like those things sort of are kind of in tension with each other, you know, and so maybe what they're saying is that what we're told by Treasure Island was the end of Flint or the end of Silver, in fact was not, you know, and but I think it's ambiguous on purpose, because we've seen what happens on the show when they're trying to make something unambiguous and extremely straightforward and clear. Like it's not, you know, it's not that they can't do that. It's not like, it isn't messy.
It's
like,
right. It's not accidental.
Not a mistake. You know? But I also understand, you know, I think to me, I think emotionally, you know, like as a queer person, I think the fact that, you know, like to watch a show that has not only like has queer men whose relationship is meaningful and queer women whose relationship is meaningful, both of, I mean, like in most shows you're lucky if you get one, and this show has like 5. So that's, so, you know, so I think, so that to me, so in some ways that changes what I see as sort of the obligation of a show to be really like intentional about, like, if you're going to, like, you know, I mean, it was Eleanor too, like, you know, Eleanor's also queer.
It's also a queer character.
And Eleanor also dies, and she doesn't die because she's queer or because she's a woman. She dies because of choices that she made as a person and choices that other characters made, all of which were in character for them and led everybody to these moments where, you know, where these things happen. And so I don't want to be a person as a TV viewer who goes through life like nothing bad can ever happen to lesbians. You know, like
Sure.
You can never tell a story about a gay character ever. Like they got to be wrapped up in bubble wrap and protected forever. Like I get the impulse of that. Like I feel like that sometimes too. But to me, it feels like the way around it is for more shows to have more gay characters and multiple gay characters and different kind, or queer, and different kinds of queer characters. And, you know, like if the only queer character your show ever introduced, say, was the villain, and then you kill them off.
Right.
It's like, that's a horrible message, you know, or if you have, you know, you have one queer relationship and then they're like, you know, about to be happy. And then they, like Willow and Tara on Buffy, you know,
Sure.
or Clark and Lexa on the 100, where you have like
one kiss or one night.
Exactly, one kiss, one night, and then boom, stray bullet, and and the randomness of life, and blah blah blah, whatever. So like all of that is super shitty, and I think it's important culturally that we are having those conversations. And I do also think mathing it out in terms of the timeline of when this show ended, like those conversations were very much and remain very much in the air. And people are protective of the gay characters on TV shows that they're emotionally attached to, with good reason. So it's like when I first watched the episode, I was like, oh my God, this is so great. They got a happy ending. And like, just like, I know this is ambiguous, but like, I want to feel happy about it. So I'm going to just hold on to the happy feeling. I'm watching it again today. I think the thing that I was the most interested in was like, all of the things that landed for me emotionally that made me feel like, like, cause the central question, right, is like, is this really happening or is this not really happening? When you watch them have that moment of,
I would argue that there's gradations of that as well, but that's.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think, so to me, it's like all of the things that I sort of latched onto that made me feel like that moment was real, that like that we were watching, this is the ending for these characters and they get this sort of beautiful, poetic moment of reunion, versus the things that make me think, somewhere along the way, some piece of this, that this is not how it happened. This is not how it played out, like that both of those things can live side by side. And I think part of it too, just for me, is like, like I'm a fanfic writer. And so I am very comfortable with a dozen different potential interpretations of a scene or a character moment or a relationship living side by side in my head. Like I think that's a lot of what fan fiction is, and what fan fiction can do is that you can sort of be like, okay, so what if it happened this way? Okay, so what if it happened this way? Okay, so this this relationship between these two characters, like in this universe, what if it goes like this? But then you change one thing, or you set it in a different place, or you do whatever,
right?
And it ends like this. And again, and all of those things are true in that they all come from, this is my understanding of the deep core of who this person is, or what their relationship is with this other person, but not necessarily like, but they're all different versions of that same kind of truth,
So what you're saying is the ambiguity that they offered us allowed even people who don't write fan fiction to kind of experience that experience?
I think so. Yeah.
I like that. That works for me a lot. I really love that.
Yeah.
As someone who loves to play with it, like that's what I like to do.
Yeah.
I mean, there is one that is most true for me. And I actually, I don't personally see any of the, except for the one that I don't speak of, that I have been banned from speaking of, which I don't actually buy. I just brought it up.
I want to hear it. I want to hear them all now, Daphne.
Okay.
Start with the bad one, and then we can talk about the less bad one.
Okay. So the really bad one, and I did say this in our finale, and it's not mine. It's just I was just trying to be thorough, podcaster.
Sure.
The awful one is that when Silver learned about that place from Max, his first thought was like, "Cool, I can send Flint there," but Thomas isn't there. He just sends Flint there and then tells Maddie the story. So that's awful. Okay. That is awful.
Yeah.
That is awful. I don't ascribe to that version. That's not a version that is like satisfying or interesting to me particularly. But it is one it is a possibility. Because we never find out. We never get confirmation in the cold open that Thomas is actually there.
Exactly. Yeah, that was something that was definitely on my list. Right. It's like we don't see the second half of that conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
So that is a version that is, again, if we're just looking at the text and the facts, that one actually does align. Nobody likes it, and I'm sorry, Liz, that I actually said it again. I blame Claire.
All right. I did ask. I do not think that is as likely, but
I don't think it's as emotionally compelling. That's why I don't like it. It's just I don't think it's particularly emotionally compelling version.
Yeah, and it makes Silver monstrous,
right, in a way that's not interesting.
Either of the other
right.
two
right.
do.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then makes him and this is something that I want to sort of circle back to more when we talk about the like, you know, like the less happy of the what if scenarios, but like there are versions of it where what it turns Maddie into, in terms of Maddie being duped.
There is no escaping. There is no escaping that to some, like that is true to some extent in every variation.
And when we open Treasure Island, don't we hear about his wife in very like vague domestic terms?
She's like, she just has like a few lines talking about her, and she has no dialogue. Like she's just a wife.
She's just what that's exactly
She's
what
just
I'm
a wife.
saying.
So no,
my point exactly.
Right. So no matter what, that's not what we want for Maddie. Right.
Yes.
Right. Like either it is Maddie and the fate that she ends up with is horrible, or, you know, or we end on this sort of tentative moment of reconciliation between him and Maddie, and at some point their relationship ends, and
which is what
Flint said would happen.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So Flint did exactly predict the thing that we're mad about.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say about both of the usual endings, we're going to put option C, tuck it away now again, back in its cave where it should remain and not be mentioned ever again, is that in my eyes, like the thing that's always been interesting to me in these years of trying not to really commit to anything while talking to people who interact with the Twitter account of the podcast, is this idea that there is actually a happy ending and a not happy ending. Like, cause I realized that after thinking that I had not actually ever said my preference, it turns out I did actually do that when I re-listened to our finale episode. I did actually say which my preference is. Did not remember that. Totally had blocked that out. Like for me personally, I guess I'll say it again now and people can get mad at me all over again. For me personally, like with all of the Greek mythology imagery in that last bit, like the happiest version for me personally, I will say this again, for me personally, I'm not imposing this on anyone else. This is what feels true, capital T true to me, is the idea that Flint and Thomas meet on the Elysian Fields. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And as heroes, like that they are reunited. In every version, they are reunited.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that for me, the version of that reuniting that rings, like that just gets my heart happy is that version, is that as heroes, they met there.
Yeah.
Still tragic. Like every version is tragic for Silver. Silver's always doing a bad thing, no matter how you see it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's totally, I mean, I think that's, to me, why I feel that either interpretation is, I mean, quote unquote, I guess a happy ending in that it provides sort of emotional satisfaction and catharsis, and that the two of them end up together, is that I feel like either way, it feels like, you know, like that they end up together in the afterlife either way, you know, like that they find each other.
No matter what, they're going to be together in the afterlife.
But I also feel like, and what is also beautiful and powerful about it is that either way, what the story is saying is that this love was the most important thing in both of their lives.
Exactly.
You know, and not in a way that minimizes Miranda, but is sort of a reminder that like the reason that Miranda is a factor in the relationship is because they lived in a world where it couldn't be just James and Thomas, you know, where like triangulating around Miranda was the only way it was possible for there to ever be them. And so the reason why, you know, why we end on the two of them and not, you know, not Ghost Miranda making another final appearance or something, is because like they never got to have a them, just the two of them. You know, like there never was a world in which Thomas and James, just as people, could be each other's person. And that's a tragedy in Miranda's life too. You know, like it's all like it was just shitty for everybody. You know, it was heartbreaking and messy and complicated and awful. And I think just the way we end on a note of that, first of all, that kind of the cardinal sin of England, of civilization, of the world that we come to really see as sort of the opposing negative force, is homophobia and bigotry,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and that closure, that emotional catharsis, and you know, and sort of satisfactory resolution comes in celebrating the power of the love between these two men. Like I mean, like to me, like honestly, like that's enough for me, you know, like that's a satisfying queer ending to me, whether we interpret it as it's happening in the afterlife or it's happening in North Carolina. You know, what it's saying about what queer love is and can be in the world, and how much it matters, and what it did to this man to have that violently stripped away from him, and what it says about the world that did that to him, and what it says about even the quote unquote seemingly nice people like Peter Ash, that they were complicit in that stripping away. Like all of those pieces that sort of that build up over the course of 4 seasons of this show, where the message that's coming through is like the world that will tell you who you can and can't love, and the world that will tell you that this beautiful connection between these two men is not just wrong and gross, but is criminal, and you will be punished for it, and we want you to die for it, and we think that it is the worst thing a person can be, juxtaposed with this world of Nassau, which is seen as being like the chaotic outlaw criminal world. I mean, it's like in some ways, doesn't it get to like the big question of like, who is a criminal? Like, what is a criminal in this world? Like the people that were sort of seen as like if you interpret the word criminal as being like a bad guy, you know, like all of our heroes are criminals. Like everybody,
all of them.
Love over the course of this show is in some way an outlaw or a rule breaker or a rebel against this establishment, because the establishment is the villain of this story. Like it's everything bad that happened because in the time that James and Thomas were living, they were not allowed to love each other, you know? And so to me, to have the ending circle back to that, where it acknowledges the weight of that, I think is really powerful. And it also gets to something like it's hard to say something that I like about Silver, because Silver does so many things afterwards that really make it harder to like it.
No, but he's amazing as a character. He's so important as a character in the context of all of that, because he's a man who could hear James talk about his love for Thomas and not flinch, and yet still be complicit in, and it's not, the tragedy isn't, like, this is always what I want to say, like, the tragedy isn't whether or not Flint is alive. The tragedy already was what he prophesized in what we call the dragon speech. The tragedy is that how the pirates will be used in the narrative of civilization going forward is what will be used to continue to subjugate people by casting shadows, and they will use the pirates. They will use these transgressive people in the future by defining them as transgressive in order to keep other people in line. No matter how you see the ending, the tragedy already happened because Silver said, "I don't care," and was willing to stop James, no matter how he stopped James. Either way, he stopped James from doing what he was doing and said, I choose that over continuing our fight.
Yeah, I choose the immediate thing that I need emotionally over the abstraction of what people that I don't know need emotionally. And I think what's interesting about that is that on some level, that is what everyone is doing at various different points. I mean, I think Eleanor does it, Vane does it, you know, Max. I think everyone at certain points has a moment where they make a choice that either is political or has political ramifications, or they justify as being, you know, sort of a big choice. And really it is about like, it's just because their heart's broken, you know, or it's just because they love somebody. And that's exactly, it's like it's Flint's whole origin story. And so I think the thing that's really beautiful about Flint and Silver's relationship in those last couple episodes is both that it's the closest they've ever been to each other and also the furthest away. It's like they both finally get like how it feels to be in the other one's shoes. You know, like Flint saying like, I understand how you feel about losing Maddie. Like I've literally been that guy. And then Flint realizing like, oh, okay. Like, or Silver realizing like, you know, I finally get what has been making you tick because I also experienced it. It's just that the thing that you think is who you are isn't really who you are. Like you think that you're doing this because you have this, you know, this desire to free the whole world. And in reality, it's just because you're angry because your heart is broken, you know? Yeah. And so both of those things are simultaneously true. It is both true that Silver, or that Flint's anger is at the totality of these forces operating in the world and the things that they're going to do and the way he's going to be used and the frustration that everything he did will have been for nothing because he's going to get turned into a cartoon villain. And also that, you know, that all of this is because like nothing that he has done filled the Thomas shaped hole in his heart. And both of those things are true at the same time.
Exactly.
I think that is why I find the ending so beautiful, neither believing that Flint is alive in North Carolina, nor that he is reunited with the love of his life in Elysian Fields or whatever you want, but just that Silver at this point has been so traumatized and so broken by his trauma and is acting from a place of such fear and control and trying to protect what little joy and happiness he can find, that in that speech when they're there in the jungle, he can say to Flint, like, I know what it is to just live out of rage and that rage be all you are. Like I see that turning point where he convinces himself, this is not my friend is dead, I'm doing him a favor, where he's telling himself this story before he can ever tell Maddie. He is telling himself, this is really what he would have wanted. Now he'll be at peace. Everyone else will be at peace. I'm doing everybody a favor. I'm stopping a war. When really he is just protecting himself. He's just, and doing that poorly.
I mean, that kind of goes back to what like the beginning of this conversation with Eleanor, like the idea that she kept saying, I'm doing this for Nassau when really she's doing it for herself.
It's a huge theme in Black Sails.
Right.
And I find it very human and beautiful and tragic and satisfying without needing to tie it up in any kind of ribbon, without even needing to understand where some of these characters are coming from, just understanding that people need to do a lot of work sometimes to make a world that they can live in.
Yeah. And I think that what it becomes about, I think in so many ways is it's like Silver has had so many chances all along the way, you know, over the course of 4 seasons of this show to, you know, to let his I think very similar in some ways to the, you know, the Eleanor thing to let his relationships with, you know, with other people matter. And he frequently chooses not to, you know, he's sort of choosing like what's easiest for himself or what's more sort of strategic for himself. And that's why it's like, it's really moving when you sort of finally watch him like assimilating into the crew and becoming one of them. You're like, oh my God, I've been waiting for you to finally put down roots somewhere. And then I think the thing that's kind of tragic about it is that when he finally finds somebody that he really like deeply, deeply loves, the way he loves Maddie, that in some ways it's like he goes all the way back around the circle and ends up back at start again. It's like now it's him and Maddie instead of just him by himself, right. But still, you know, like he's just a person where, you know, if you're inside his bubble, he will burn the whole world down to protect you. And if you're outside his bubble, it kind of doesn't matter. And what's interesting about his arc is how different people at different times move in and out of that bubble. And by the end of it, it's really just Maddie, you know, and Maddie in some ways,
she doesn't want to be there. She's like, I don't agree to this geography of care.
And it's in some ways, it's even Maddie at the expense of himself, you know, like that it is that he he's sort of dooming himself to a life where I think he knows, that his relationship with the rest of the, the pirate family that they built, like he's lost that in some ways, and that his relationship with Flint is, whether Flint is dead or alive, that relationship's over, right. And but again, I think that he makes his choice that he's telling himself is benevolent. Like he's sort of telling himself the story about this being for some greater good. That is the story that everyone on the show at some point, faced with a life or death kind of kill or be killed moment, tells themselves a story about why they're doing the things they do. And
I would argue except Max.
Yeah, I think you're right.
She's the only one that when she actually betrays the people close to her, she is 100% saying, you know what, this is for me. Like, this is what I need for myself. When in fact, most of the time she is actually buoying everyone else up with her as she rises. And the moment when she betrays, she says, this is for me because I need it.
Yeah. And she's not cutthroat about it, but she's also not making it worse by pretending like it's something other than what it is. And that she's not doing it, like she doesn't do things for herself, just sort of like there's no narcissism in it. Like if you trace it back to that, the beginning of her arc and, on the beach with Vane's men, it's like everything that she does for herself is in aid of her protection and her security and her maintaining the position of power that she has worked so hard to accrue that keeps her safe. So even her selfishness, if you can call it that, is defensible because you understand why. Like, yeah, I would keep making those choices too, and that it costs her, like it costs her to feel like she's screwing Anne over, and it costs her to realize that, like when she sees Anne again and she has to sort of confront the fact that like she has potentially permanently destroyed that relationship. Like we see the emotional vulnerability that she has around Anne that she doesn't really show around anybody else. But still, like I loved like that scene where she's like, I loved you and I betrayed you and I'm not going to apologize.
I could tell you a story, but I'm not going to.
Right, because you'd know, like if I told you something that seemed like it wasn't true, you'd know that wasn't me, and Silver, the thing I think is like, I think in some ways the most compelling evidence, if you're kind of weighing the scales, in some ways I think the most compelling evidence that Silver is lying to Maddie when he tells her the story is how badly he wants it to be true when he says like, I'm not him, I'm not a monster, like I'm not the person that you think that I am, like I'm a good guy, like I'm not, like I've preserved some piece of, of a soul, that after, like I would never, I would never do something out of this level of like coldness and callousness and cruelty that I can see from the way that you're looking at me is who you think that I am. Like, I need you to believe that I'm not this asshole that you think that I am, and he's so, he's like teary, like he's so palpably emotional about it that it is, it's just like, you are working really, really hard here, guy.
When this is bad boyfriend material right here. I see this. I just need a leather jacket and a motorcycle and to be under my window when my dad said you had to go home.
Yeah. It's like, oh my God, run, Maddie, run. Like if you had a soul alive, he would not let you do this.
Exactly. Claire, it was so lovely to meet you and talk to you about all these things. I have to run, but ladies, please go on. And I can't wait till next time.
Thanks so much. It was so great to talk to you.
I love you, Liz.
Love you too. Bye.
Sail!
I just had to use that sales bit. I hadn't used it in so long. Like Liz said, Claire and I had a lot to say after she left us, and that will be in part 2, which I will release soon. So this was, I think, our first time where we're going to have part 1 and part 2 of a single interview, but I just didn't want this one to go too long. So thanks for listening. New episode coming soon. Some more with me and Claire Willett. Okay, bye.
Deep is a Common Room Radio production. For more information and access to other programs, please visit us at commonroomradio.com. To show your support, pledges of as little as $1 a month can be made to patreon.com/commonroomradio. Join the conversation by using the hashtag FathomsDeep and follow us on Twitter at BlackSalesCast. We ask that you keep your tweets respectful and positive, and please avoid spoilers. If you have more to say, we want to hear it in all its spoiler glory. Email us at podcast@commonroomradio.com with Fathoms Deep in the subject line. Thanks for listening.